Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Tepper, and I am the marketing manager here at GDS Link, and I will be today's moderator. First and foremost, we hope you all are doing well, considering the current unique circumstances, and hope you all are continuing to stay safe. We want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us for part one of our two-part webinar series surrounding analytics, leveraging analytics to drive value in the new normal. Due to the prevalence of new obstacles, such as fluctuating unemployment rates, forbearance offerings, and increased provisions, the current environment and foreseeable future will require lenders to evaluate a value-driven analytics function, have a rapid response to market changes, and deploy the latest analytic approaches to stay competitive. Today, GDS Link's analytics team will discuss how organizations and lenders can win in the new normal, increase ROI with reduced spend and better solutions, and drive value with access to alternative data sources. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. In the interest of time and getting everyone in and out in a reasonable manner, I will address any questions toward the end of the presentation. The slide deck from today will be emailed out to all attendees later this afternoon, and the webinar is currently being recorded, and a replay will be available for viewing through our website, gdslink.com, as well as our social media channels. If you have not done so already, I would highly encourage you all to follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook, where you can stay up to date on latest industry trends, as well as GDS Link's latest offerings. Before we get started, I wanted to provide a formal introduction of our panelists, Florian, Lyonnet, and Carl Spilker. Florian Lyonnet is the Chief Data Scientist at GDS Link, holding a PhD in theoretical physics and boasting 8 years of experience building analytical solutions using standard analytics, machine learning, and optimization. Throughout his career, Florian has developed predictive models for a wide range of business problems with a strong focus on the credit lifecycle. Carl Spilker is the EVP of Analytics and Advisory here at GDS Link. Carl is an accomplished executive within global consumer lending, boasting over 20 years of industry experience. Prior to joining GDS Link, Carl has held senior leadership roles for companies such as Easy Corp, Provident Financial Group, Dollar Financial Group, Lloyd's TSB, GE Private Label Credit Cards, and Experian ScoreX. Carl has a proven executive management track and over 20 years experience delivering consumer lending products offline and online, utilizing complex analytical instruments and experience in small business portfolio management. Well-versed in the prime, subprime, and deep subprime lending for the challenges to deliver best-in-class risk, analytics, and profitability across multi-channel products and services. So with all that said, Carl, Florian, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. A quick little status check, Matt, just to make sure that you are clear on the screen for everybody.
Yep, we are awesome. Good to go.
Awesome. So one of the things I took a step back. First of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us. This is a pleasure to kind of put together something like this, but it's also just kind of highlights, I think, my own personal nervousness about our current situation. I've been through a couple of scenarios like this where we've had some devastating economic impact, but nothing when I start stacking up what's occurred. What is it now? We're in the 30 millions of unemployed. Economists suggesting we're in the 10 to 20% if you talk to some unemployment rate. Interesting kind of subset. It's not necessarily a blue collar being impacted. It's quite a number of white collar as well as executive level hitting that unemployment impact from this pandemic. Store closures, that was something that kind of came to mind as I was looking into it. Just the amount of restaurants and stores that have just shut down and been put out of business is huge. I also saw a couple of articles I found of interest of the sizable banks now posting up very large provisions, which we all know is provisions for future expected losses. So there's something that they're seeing that's making them nervous, obviously. You look at the debt levels. So just the total unsecured debt levels have been increasing. I was just digging up another note here about the 2.2 trillion in additional government debt that got pushed out as part of the stimulus program, and also to cover unemployment. I think after that, personally, I probably can't even count how much more economic impact dollars has gone out. We've heard a lot too about the forbearance. Is that a ticking time bomb? What is it? 15 million I saw in some statistics of credit cards were put into these forbearance and hardship programs. Lastly, I'm not an economist, but are we in an inflationary or a stagflation type of period coming up in the future? And then liquidity forecasting, post-stimulus sits ahead. So I wanted to take a second and say this is kind of what I'm seeing as the immediate pressing. So I wanted to prepare what I'll call after the timeline, and when we focus on analytics, many cases we try to leverage the historical performance to estimate what we believe is going to occur in the future. And from all those things I described, if you kind of think about it, pre-2019, around that January, March period, as this COVID pandemic's been identified and actions were being put into place to kind of slow, if not quarantine large groups of people. And I laid out this quarantine period estimating between that March to June. So from there, you had a significant kind of rolling quarantine. Obviously, travel's limited. This unemployment rate that we spoke to and shared, that was at a dramatic high during this period, offset with some stimulus. So I wanted to lay at the top a bit of a timeline as I saw it, and then the impact and assumptions below. So we left a good economic, kind of a rapid growth period, and we went into just a bit of a stalemate. So the question that we hope to be able to address with you, and Florian's going to go into more of the empirical side of this, is what is the new normal, and what are the tools that you've been relying on, and how do we, from our personal experience, believe that they're going to behave. And then for our second part of the webinar, we want to get a little more tactical, if that makes sense, and maybe talk through some of the data points that we'd be seeing. The other thing too in this new normal is going to be, will there be a secondary stimulus? Will things drop and you see even increasing numbers of either unemployment, evictions? There's a tremendous amount of unknown setting up for us, probably post this December-ish timeframe from my estimations. So, how are lenders responding? I'm going to start from the bottom just because I love this. Pretty much the majority of folks are looking for ways to improvise, adapt, and overcome what's in front of them. And it feels like change is occurring very quickly. Jumping to the top, what's the other thing that became abundantly clear during this period of time is the importance of their digital strategy and the importance of being flexible during this period of time. We've had a chance to kind of be part of and introduce some new sources of data, particularly around what I'll call bank transaction solutions and leveraging some non-credential bank type of data. A tremendous amount of interest in bridging some more recent, fresh information to hand that can speak to a customer's affordability situation, employment, stability of their income. Those are some things that are really capturing a lot of attention. The other thing is stress testing your models and portfolio. And Florian and I'll kind of tuck into this a little bit later, but the fear is during this period of time, are your models just going to fall apart and turn into a random digit generator, or will there still be some value in it? So we do see quite a bit of activity around stress testing the models and existing portfolios. What I'm going to do here in a second, I'm going to move it over and look for Florian to step in and give you kind of his thoughts and opinion around, are these empirical models that we all do rely on, are they at risk? So Florian?
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. So, yeah, I think in any situation like the one we're going through with the current pandemic, I think the question that keeps me up at night the most is as Carl said, are my models really going to fall apart completely, break down, or is there still going to be some value in it? And to answer that question, I usually like to take a step back and think about how these models are being built, right? Because at the end of the day, these models are just complicated function, that live in a multidimensional parameter space defined by a couple data elements that are supposed to capture the financial capacity of a borrower to pay back a debt, face obligations, right? Now, of course, as the financial stress increases and unemployment rises and maybe there's lots of income, utilization on the credit card goes up. If I look at these data element distributions of my through-the-door population, of course these start shifting. And what might have been an average income for my borrower of $3,000 is now shifting to $2,500 and maybe a $2,000. Now, what that means is that your borrowers basically is shifting from one profile A to profile B and profile C maybe. So his score might be degrading as he's moving through financial difficulties. Now, this being said, this profile B or C where your original borrower is now at might already have been captured by your model initially, right? If your model was correctly built on a range of different borrowers' profile, it's not said that this new borrower is unknown. I mean, actually, most of the time what we see at a high level is that this profile was already known. I already had in my distribution borrowers that had a $2,000 income per month. And that means that at a high level, usually what we see is that scores, custom scores, generic score, they still rank order pretty well. This means that I'm still having a pretty good rank ordering out of my model. Now, of course, because data is limited and the number of data elements I'm using inside my model is limited as well, there are new situations that are just not captured, that are unknown. For instance, I might be helping a grandparents or parents go through this pandemic because loss of income and related effects, and that means that okay, my borrower that used to be a 680 is going to slowly drift down to a 630, and that's okay. What's going to be really different is that this 630 that used to be a 2% default rate tranche is now potentially going to be a 4% or 5%, and I think that's where we have to focus our interest, is to recover this broken link between the risk as expressed by the model score and the actual loss rate. So I think that's a really important point. Now, I think that what's important here is to really monitor these variables, because as we've said, as they start shifting, they're going to be early indicators of potential problems down the line. And I cannot stress that enough. I think we need to have frequent, detailed monitoring of the models and of the data elements that make them. Now, the other thing that we want to keep in mind, of course, is that there's another problem, which is that there is a lag between the new financial situation of an individual and its reflection in the data that we're using. And that's also something that's going to put your models at risk, because if you've got 60 days to kind of get an updated picture of your borrower, well, you've got this lapse of time where you can potentially be completely blind, or your decision is going to be off. And I think that's an area where we believe bank transaction data can be a game changer. It's bringing a lot of granularity into the decision, and we this is something we're happy to discuss in greater details. But we believe that adding new data sources, looking for a higher recency, being able to dig deeper into the borrower's profile are going to be key to go through these difficult times. Now, the other thing is that there's also potentially early indicators in credit reports of COVID-19 related impacts. And these can also be used to specialize your underwriting to specific situations. We've looked into that as well. We've developed a tri-bureau set of attributes, to kind of identify the situation, and that can also help in the short term to kind of, drive different underwriting decisions. So if we move on, Carl, if you can swap, yeah. So I think the other thing is that we really need to get an infrastructure in place that's going to allow us to have a much more agile approach to model building, model deployment, and monitoring as a whole, or what we usually call, the model lifecycle. And we can't really hope to go through the current situation where the economy is changing so fast, and things rapidly move, with a old scenario where it takes 2 months to build a model, 2 months to put it in production, and then maybe do the monitoring once a year, twice a year. That's just not going to work. What we're pushing for, and what we're hoping to see more and more, is a situation where we have a very compressed model lifecycle, where we can rapidly iterate through multiple versions of a model through efficient tools, deploy these models in a couple days, put them automatically under a monitoring program, where we're going to look at all the variables that feed the model on a regular basis, as often as possible, feedback the performance data such that we can make sure the model is performing where it's supposed to be. And then, that allows us to have very early detection of shifts, and to then, adapt for these shifts and potentially retune the models, redeploy on a very short time scale. With my preferred emphasis on the last 3 blocks, this deployment, monitoring, retuning, that's the core, I think, of what we need to focus our attention.
Florian,
yeah.
I was just looking at a question from our friends down in Colombia. They were asking about how often you'd anticipate that model requiring a retune or rebuild.
Yeah, I think actually that's a great question. Thanks for bringing it up. I think that again, that really depends on the economic situation, and I think in the current pandemic that we're going through, the best is to have constant monitoring of these variables. This way, whenever your population starts shifting, you can have these early warnings. And then as soon as the lender has the capability to provide this feedback data, performance data, then you can have a second run of analysis, which goes a lot deeper into, the performance of the model, or the trenches, the different trenches of your risk moving, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and there's kind of an add-on to that, which I was going to kind of bring up during the conversation, which is the data is now shifting to just huge levels of transactional velocity. You mentioned the credentialed, not credentialed, which is kind of daily transactional type of detail. How do you feel that impacts the stability of these models over time versus a traditional bureau?
Yeah, I think these are really interesting because these models that are built on bank transaction data in general, I think they've got a much better grasp or much better recency and reflection of the current economical situation. So whenever there is a loss of income and any hardship that happens to the borrower, these models are going to capture the new state or the new profile of this applicant on a much shorter time frame than standard models would do. And I think that's why we like these models so much in the current situation. So if we move on to the next slide.
Hey, Florian, just one other question that popped up from someone else was the monitoring the models. What type of metrics of how you have helped other clients during this?
Yeah, so I think there are multiple things we look at. We usually look at the performance of the model itself in terms of AUC, KS, Gini type metric. But then we also look at the variable level. You want to make sure that every variable's power to discriminate between your good and bad is staying at the same or high level. So we've got these kind of two different levels of monitoring. And then of course, as I said, because in current times we kind of broke the link between the risk evaluation represented by the score of the model and the actual loss rate, default rate, you want to also monitor how this relationship is moving. And I think that's really important because you need to recalibrate your model. You need to learn in this new normal what's going to be the relationship between risk and your loss rate or default rate.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, Florian, just for the others, is that there's really three challenges: is the data. So how frequent, the shape of the information, stability of it, timeliness. The second one's kind of your technology, the infrastructure. And the other one's kind of driven by the modeling approach. As we're moving towards more AI framework, machine learning based models on high velocity data, that infrastructure becomes even more important. So to build a traditional regression model that you hope stands stable, but maybe not have quite the predictive value you're looking for, it can be replaced now once you've got the infrastructure, new data, and complex modeling techniques, and the ability to be able to retune and rebuild and capture any variables and population shifts quicker to keep you in a place that you can play with the highest fidelity predictive model to hand.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll bump you to the next page.
Yep.
There we go.
Okay, and to echo what you just said, I think that the model lifecycle is one thing, but going with that, the ability to test into new data sources is really important. As situation is evolving so fast, and as things move, we need to be able to test in different data sources. We want to be able to notice that we've got a problem with fraud, for instance, and then be able to turn on and off different data sources for a couple weeks, couple months, store that into our ML ready data warehouse kind of infrastructure, do your analytics, potentially build a new model, redeploy this model, turn off some of the data sources, and so on and so forth. Right. So you want to have this ability to iterate through models and through analytics exercise, both on the model building side, but also on the data. Because I'm a big partisan of saying that you can build less kind of hours building something that you just can't explain. You will not get as much lift as working on your data and bringing in new attributes or new data sources. That's always going to be, in my opinion, a much better option. So I think having this ability to test into multiple different data sources is going to be key to adapt to this changing profile of borrowers. In a current project we just completed, we tested up to 19 different data sources with one of our clients to build both a fraud and a default model. And there are a couple of things we learned from this. One is we were able to bring in new technology through the use of machine learning and how do we deploy them, retune them, and so on. That allowed us from the benchmark traditional model to get an additional 4 points in terms of AUC, which of course translates into real dollar at the end of the day. And then in the second step, we were able to bring about a 14 points increase on top of the baseline model by bringing both the technology and additional data sources. And I think that's really interesting because at the end of the day, when you factor in the cost of buying this extra data and so on and so forth, and the added lift that we got from it, you do end up with an ROI of about 19 to 20%, which are a huge increase. And in in the current situation, because this was pre-pandemic, but in the current situation, it becomes even more important because you might see your performance and your ROI degrade if you can't adapt to the changing situation. So I think this ability to test into multiple data sources and have this quick iteration from a model building perspective is going to be critical.
Which begs the application flow that's going to happen is what you're used to seeing may not be the same profile that you're going to see tomorrow. What data you may have used may be fine, or it could be augmented with some additional data sources that are available. And then lastly, just evaluating and testing additional data sources puts you in a place of knowledge rather than, say, ignorance of what you could have missed out on. And the very last piece is obviously there's a cost to acquire proposition too, as you're cycling through various data sources.
Yes.
A question that came up, Florian, given the long outcome period relative to the fast-paced COVID world of most credit models, how are the new models being tested?
Yeah, so I mean that's a really good question. I mean there is no answer to it, right? Obviously, I mean if you know very well that you need the performance data before you can evaluate the model, but what we can do is test into the stability of the model, so that it goes back to Carl's point earlier that people do stress testing on these models. So what we can do is, for instance, look at how these models are changing or responding to variation of the input profiles. So you can run simulation on this, see how your model is going to respond. And as you see the through-the-door population coming in, you see what's the extent of these changes potentially on these variables. So that's quite interesting. And the other thing that we have done, for instance, for using bank transaction data, is to build models and then start evaluating them on first payment default. So after the first billing cycle, basically 30 days, you got your first, first payment default definition. It's not perfect, but it already gives you an idea of where you are. And as you get the second billing cycle and third billing cycle, you already have your, straight roller, potentially straight roller definition coming in, and you can, if you have this infrastructure in place where you can, build a model, deploy them, retune them quickly, I think you're in a really good place to have a strategy like this, where you start with a, kind of almost generic model and then evolve it as you see the changes coming through the door.
Yeah, and hopefully don't scare the audience too much, but the stress testing piece kind of reminds me of a Basel II type of initiative that many of the banks did. And through a lot of that, what I've learned is that It's not that models don't flip on their head and become random. There's still some rank ordering. It's the scale of the impact that really costs the business. So your A grade paper that you're buying that you predicted at a 2% dollar loss rate becomes 4. That's happens to be the area that you're giving up, your risk-based pricing, those to your best rate and seeing double the loss rate. So it financially kind of shifts things quite a bit. So that would be one of the first takes. Your C paper that you're estimating be 8% loss rate shoots up to 20. The scale and intensity of that prediction is what you want to stay on top of. And then I think our advanced abilities now to do a bit of stress testing on the inputs influencing the model can give you a sense of how your model is going to shift in prediction, allow you to do a bit of a old model stress new model swap set. Which I hope in our next webinar, we might be able to dig into a little bit of some more detail. Florian, there's another question that popped in. Seeing any other, are you seeing any data sources other than bank transaction data being used increasingly due to COVID? For example, a digital footprint data?
I think the digital footprint data use we've seen increased over the couple last year actually, and not necessarily due to the pandemic, but in general, I think it's being used more and more with very positive results. As it relates to COVID itself, I haven't seen personally a significant increase in their use.
Yeah, I think in the speaking to this, the takeaways is digital intensify your focus on the digital transformation initiatives. Absolutely, probably the highest use of this digital piece is occurring on the fraud side. So that piece is, I think, if you read many of the articles and from my friends in the industry, there is a lot of fraud activity occurring. And so I believe that digital footprint is starting to increase, and definitely having that as one of your weapons in your digital strategies is a must. Our other takeaway that we would chat about is accelerate your cash flow, which I see people are beginning to do now, but everything's pretty much is what optimizes the cash back into your business. And that goes back to pretty much the crux of our conversation was the models aren't going to completely inverse and flip. There's still going to be a value, but being able to adapt and modify them quicker allows you to optimize this cash flow scenario. I think, Florian, you really dug into this nicely, but evaluating the new sources of data, because is it the environment that changes or the potential data that changes drive these scenarios? And then lastly, lean on those industry experts inside your industry and outside of your sector to review and evaluate what you're looking at. I think it's a helpful thing to always do. I find myself personally, I'll get locked in from a analytic perspective, and it's good to have somebody in a different sector open my eyes up on the way I'm viewing the world. Anything you wish to add, Florian, and then we can revert to some questions?
No, I think that's great.
Excellent. And Matt, I'm gonna go see if there's a few more questions. Otherwise,
yeah, it seems that we did get a couple of other questions. How do you factor in population shift, and what have you seen this do to a model's ability to predict?
Yeah, so I think again it depends. Like, it's not because your variable starts shifting that it necessarily has an impact on your model. Actually, I think I tried to give my opinion earlier, which is that as a matter of fact, you might have all your variables shift and still have a perfectly fine model. It just means that, you're getting more of a certain type of profile in your through-the-door population. Problem occurs when the trend or the relationship between these variables and the risk occur. And, whenever you have a change in this relationship, that's when you have problems with your model and when potentially your model starts shifting. Now, when it comes to how do you account for that? Well, one thing that people do sometimes is to, adjust these weights for the model. So to penalize certain variables when they feel like the relationship isn't quite what they expect it to be. But frankly, there is not much apart from remodeling and refitting your model.
Hey, Florian, I got another question here that I'm going to kind of augment a bit. It was, are there solutions to bring a few variables on bank transaction data quickly and at a lower cost? And the answer is yes. We've been in a position where we want to get people integrated live to where they can collect and leverage the data for a period of time, particularly if they don't have any historical data to build models around. And
yeah, and that's really important for BT data in particular, right? Because for BT data, because you've got such a short time frame between, because you can pull this data as often as you want, or like it's an instant snapshot of the financials of an individual. I think this is a really important point, because you want to be able to, you want to be able to build this model after your first pay cycle, basically. As soon as you get your first, missed first payment, you can already build your first model based on this kind of temporary definition, so to speak. But because the thing with bank transaction is that you're pulling 90 days of history. So you can always put yourself back at least 3 months from the event that occurs. So, when you start your model on day one, after 30 days, someone misses the first payment, well, you already have 90 days of history. So you can already put yourself backwards in time, and that gives you a lot more flexibility.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a really good point. But the question that came up here, and I'm gonna leave this to your feet, Florian, because I think this is right down your sweet spot. If I build a model on historical data, and I go live with that data, what have you seen happen to that model, just generally speaking?
You mean is that
retro,
to be
retro, the score versus live and the score?
taking into account the pandemic situation, or in general time?
In general.
In general. We usually see models degrade after a while. We see performance lead over time slowly. But we've had, in normal times, we've had models run successfully, meaning, at a fairly high accuracy for quite a long time, right? That doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing the monitoring, though, because part of the reason is how do you say that? You select your variables upfront such that they're going to be the less subject to changes as possible. So when you do that and you monitor your variables, in traditional scorecard, for instance, you're able to adjust the weight as these relationships slightly move. And sometimes when you have this feedback process in place, you can actually keep these models without having to redevelop them for quite a long time. And I've seen models run for year, 2 years without needing a full redevelopment before. So to stay aligned with your development cycle, basically.
Yeah. And one question that popped up, I should have answered this earlier, was we mentioned bank transaction. There's credentialed versus non-credentialed. The credentialed is a plaid or a Yodlee where the customer signs on to the the account. We're able to revert back model policy ready variables. The non-credential is data that we've been testing into that comes from many of these payment providers, FIS, Fiserv, TSYS, for example, kind of monetizing their existing data and insights, and it provides more of a bank and velocity check that we've been adding into our model development side, and turning out to be quite predictive and productive for teasing out risk and fraud.
If any folks have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to Carl or Florian. They're obviously great resources for everything discussed today. And before we wrap up, just a reminder that today's webinar is part 1 of our 2-part webinar series surrounding analytics. You each should receive an invite in the next few days for our next webinar session, where we will actually take you through an actual use case so that you all can see our solutions truly in action. But again, want to thank you all again for your attendance this afternoon. Thank you to Florian and Carl for their insights, and we hope that this was a valuable resource for you all. Again, these slides and a replay of today's webinar will be available to you all later today. And thank you again, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Matt.